The following was recorded in front of a live studio audience at the Studio 21 Podcast Café. This is the United Podcast Network.
Want to shake up your small business marketing? I mean, really shake it up.
Studio 21 Podcast Café.
Have you been thinking about doing your own podcast?
Studio 21 Podcast Café.
Would you like to take your business to the next level?
Studio 21 Podcast Café.
This is the golden age of podcasting, and it's time to stop thinking and start doing.
Studio 21 Podcast Café.
Get your message heard 24/7, 365, over and over again.
Studio 21 Podcast Café.
Welcome to the 21st century.
Welcome to the Studio 21 Podcast Café.
Here's the creator and host of the Studio 21 Podcast Café, David Garofalo.
Welcome, everybody, to the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, a 21-minute or less weekly podcast to help you get your message out, grow your business, and build your bottom line. Let me help you bring your marketing and advertising into the 21st century. My name is David Garofalo. I've been doing podcasting since 2010 and created a six-figure income from doing podcasting. It's a 21-minute podcast, so let's start the clock. And here we go. Today's topic, Plan B. You should always have a Plan B. You should have a Plan A, but right. Plan B is something different, not than doing your regular podcast. It's Plan B. If you're a podcaster or you want to be a good or great podcaster and have a great podcast, successful and profitable and not frustrated and poor, you already know you must do the 3 P's in podcasting. I made this up. The 3 P's in podcasting: plan, prepare, and perform. Each and every week for your podcast. So plan, prepare, and perform the podcast, right? Plan the podcast, prepare for it, get your show notes, your bullet notes, everything together, and then perform the podcast. Those are must-dos for doing a podcast. So plan in advance. Plan your podcast in advance. And I would say at least a week in advance, you want to plan that podcast, what the topic will be. You want to plan that in advance so that the week previous to that, you can let your audience know what next week's topic is going to be. So you must have already put a plan together to say, this is what we're going to be talking about the week in advance, so you could tell your audience, next week, look forward to this, right? With a little tease maybe. And you can make them want to tune in. That's the whole idea. You have them already. So you want to tease them, let them know what it is. They enjoyed this podcast. They hear it next week, and they're going to actually, at that point, subscribe to your show because it's interesting to them what it's going to be. They want to make sure they don't forget. This is your opportunity to drive people who already listened to your podcast, that episode they just listened to listen again next week. I call it a bounce back. You want to bounce them back to come back listening to your show. Why would you not take that opportunity? They're already listening to the show.
I think too many people are just trying to keep up with this week, and you really have to get ahead of the curve.
That's it.
And plan.
So at least 1 week. And I like to even go further than that, and I go crazy sometimes. I got a list of everything I want to do and how they connect to each thing.
And that's a good thing to do. You have your notebook, and whenever an idea occurs to you, you make sure it gets added to the list. And
keep it going. For me to do my cigar podcast I've been doing since 2010, and incidentally a 2-hour show, I better have some topics set up in advance. If I ever found myself the week before and say, I don't even know what we're going to do next week, oh my God, I'm in trouble.
Right.
Because now I'm going to need a lot of time to prepare a 2-hour show because I've done nothing.
Well, and even when we decided we were doing a show about nothing,
yes.
We planned when that show would be so that you could tease it the week before.
Right, and get a good listenership because it actually turned out to be a good show about nothing, and that was it. So why would you not engage them into listening to next week's show? Why would you do that to yourself? You wouldn't, you shouldn't, and you can't. You have to let them know in advance what you're going to do because they're already here. It's so hard to bring new people on to find your show. At least take the ones you already have and drive them onto there. And then little by little, you're adding to it. What happens to a lot of podcasters is they're losing some and bringing some in, and they notice that they're dropping a little or just staying the same. There's not a lot happening here, and that's because the amount that they're losing, because they didn't engage them to bring them back. I told you last week that we were going to do this week, which was bounce you back to Plan B. What is Plan B? You're a podcaster already, maybe, and you say, I don't even know what Plan B is. Maybe that drove you into it. You're thinking about podcasting, and you say, well, I know what the plan is, the 3 Ps, the plan, prepare, and perform the podcast, but I don't know what Plan B even is. Well, that's why you're here, and I'm telling you what Plan B is, and that's because I drove you to end up doing that. So preparing your episode, for the episode, you have the questions, right? You have the questions you're going to ask, that you're going to interview somebody to. You have the bullet points of things that you are going to be talking about during the show and things that you want to discuss. And I have more than enough all the time, and I cross them out as I go on, and then I have some stuff left over. You throw them away, you save them for another interview or whatever. Nothing goes to waste. You save it, you're going to use it for something else.
Sometimes even during the course of a show, you realize, okay, here's an idea for a whole nother show. Correct. That we can do. Because of what direction that went to. It's all neatly put in the correct order that makes sense. I don't want to go into one direction and then go into a total direction, forget where I am, and then go back to that. Sometimes, depending on who you're talking to, it ends up going that way. That's why my bullet points are there, so I know where to go back to, right? It's a roadmap. Let me go back to where it is, because the notes that I put down, and I spent 20 minutes doing it, organized to let me go to exactly where we are. Here we are breaking the momentum of the show right now, and I have to figure out where I am now. So I go right back to my notes here, and here's the information where I want to go. I think it's important that people don't have to get everything they wrote down into a show.
Yes.
You know, if the show's the length it needs to be and it seems like a natural stopping point, stop the show.
That's the beautiful part about podcasting. Unlike a radio show that you have to fill up so much time, and then what do you end up saying? You better have more than enough stuff or you're in trouble. TV, the same thing. But when it comes to podcasting, when I'm done talking, I'm done talking. This show, 21 minutes or less.
Or less.
And we've gone over.
Yeah.
And that's okay, too. I try not to, because I appreciate your time being on, coming to listen to the show. You're driving in the car right now. You're going to wherever it is. And I don't want to keep you on longer than you need to. I'm trying to jam it down and give you all the information I possibly can in that kind of time. And maybe you're listening to the show because you say, my commute is about 21 minutes or less. Let me listen to this show on Thursdays, maybe. If that's the day. We're doing the show on Wednesday, and I'm imagining that a lot of people are listening on Thursday, and we can find those numbers out in another show and tell you how we look at that.
You know, it's interesting because I was sort of looking at a podcast group, and people were saying, well, do I need to do a show for the holidays? Well, the answer is yes. Yeah. People sometimes think, well, no one listens over the holidays. Well, what they do is travel.
Right.
And a lot of people.
Biggest travel day of the year.
And do you want your episode not to be in their rotation?
Sure.
I think that's a mistake.
And maybe they're going to find your competitor who's there for them.
Right.
Right?
You got to be there for the audience.
That's it. So you have all the vitals when you're talking to, putting notes down for the guest that you're talking to. Names, addresses, phone numbers, websites, everything that you may need to have in case they don't have it when you ask the question. It's there on paper so you can easily reference them and have a spectacular episode without, I don't know that, we'll get back to you, we'll put it in the show notes. We can put it in the show notes also, but why wouldn't I have it here? Because I'm going to probably need it. So I have it here. So all that's left at that point is to perform. So the performance has begun. To perform, you execute, you do the show, or it happens. It happens. The guest calls in sick. They call in with traffic problems. They call in with some sort of an excuse, and we've heard them all.
A tooth problem.
Yeah.
That's the most recent, right?
Right? You've heard them all.
Yep.
Or worse yet, they don't call in at all. They just don't even show up, and we've seen that.
Actually, that's the most recent. That happened to one of our hosts.
Yeah. So here you are doing 16 podcasts a week. You've seen all these things happening, and a lot of people don't have Plan B, and that's why we're doing this type of show to help our podcasters here at the Studio 21. What the heck do you do? And, you assume they have a Plan B. They don't have a Plan B. They need to have a Plan B. The guy doesn't call in at all. That's going to be the host. He pulls the no-show. You're standing here. So what does that mean? No show?
And you've covered it in another episode, but this is where having one in the can ready to go is important, because what if something happens to you as the host?
Absolutely.
Then you can't make it.
Correct. That's the one that's the game changer right there. But a no-show means that they said they were coming in to be on the show, and with no call, no warning, no notice at all, they never show up. So that's a no-show. Right? They did a no-show. But does that mean a no-show means there is no show? There's not going to be a show? Not if you have a Plan B. The show must go on is a phrase in show business, meaning that regardless of what happens, whatever show has been planned is still going to be staged for the waiting patrons. The waiting patrons are you, the person listening to the podcast. The show must go on originated in the 19th century with circuses. If an animal got loose or a performer got injured, the ringmaster in the band would try to keep things going so that the crowd would not panic, because it is a point of honor not to let the other players down by deserting them, and no understudy is available. Right. So the show is going to go on, and that little segment may not happen. Instead of that was the band was playing, or the ringmaster got up and whipped his thing or whatever.
As you say, always an understudy. Well, the crowd may be a little disappointed, but the show's not canceled.
Right. The show must go on. That is show business, and all you have is a podcast, right? You're not in show business. Wrong. You are in show business. Your show, your podcast, is a show. So what do? As a podcaster, you must have the Plan B. Actually, you should have a file on your computer, or in my case, a little book. I'm old school, right? I write it down still. A little book where I end up writing down these things and have some information. No show topics, because the show must go on. Hoping not to use them, they are my insurance plan, and already planned out completely, just in case it happens, the no-show. And it does. It happens. Yep. Life happens. And when it happens, you turn the page to Plan B and execute. Is that the show that was already planned? No, it is not. But I have bullet points in place. I have the subject matter, and it's pretty relatively easy for me to perform that show because it's there. What should you be putting in your Plan B book as far as topics are concerned? And more importantly, what should you never put in that book for an unplanned show? We're going to get to that in 1 minute.
If you're in the area of Boston North into southern New Hampshire and you're thinking about doing a podcast, there is a place you have to see. It's called Studio 21 Podcast Café. Located right over the border into Salem, New Hampshire, Studio 21 Podcast Café is a live, working, full-service podcast and vodcast, that's video on demand, studio. All professional equipment, professional producer, and total distribution of your podcast is done for you. Would you like search engine optimization for more people to find your business, or better ranking on Google? Well, Studio 21 Podcast Cafe can do it all for you for far less than you think. Schedule a free 21-minute, no-obligation consultation by going to www.studio21podcast.cafe. That's studio21podcast.cafe. Now, back to the program.
And we're back, and today we're talking about Plan B. You should always have a Plan B. You got a no-show. The guest who you planned on doing the episode with today didn't call, didn't email, just didn't show up at all. You have an insurance plan for that type of thing so that the show must go on.
And, this is a difference I see when it happens to some of our hosts. They just pace and they freak out.
Yeah.
And with our show, even if a guest, it's 5 minutes before, we know we're going on.
We're going on.
We have a plan. If the guest shows up, we'll bring them in.
How long do you wait? Zero.
You don't.
The show, we say the show is going to start at a certain time. We'd let them know in advance of it. Obviously, it wasn't that important to them. Or something happened to them.
When I schedule the guests, I ask them to show up a half hour early and to let them know we're going at noontime,
right?
No matter what,
right? And that's going to end up happening. And if I'm on Plan B and I'm doing Plan B and Plan B is going good, and they walk in,
you don't need them.
I don't need them. I end up finishing Plan B, and then if I want, here they are. We could tape a show.
Sure.
If there's time to end up doing that, then we have one in the can, right?
Yeah.
Have that extra show. So, what show you're doing is not exactly the show that you planned on doing. It's a different show on a totally different subject. What should you not be doing on that show of the subject without that guest? The short answer is they didn't show up and apparently was the expert on that show. So you actually don't want to do the exact show that guest didn't show up at because they were the expert.
Right.
So you're going to try to you're going to give them less of a show, right? You're going to do that show without that person, without the expert, and try to pull it off. Probably a mistake to do it. It should be a totally different show.
Right.
Save that show.
You could reschedule.
You could reschedule with that person if you wanted to, or if you were mad enough and you didn't want to do it, you bring somebody else in it. Yeah. But that show is that show, and that show is gone. Now it becomes a different subject, is what I would say. If you think you know that subject well enough, I think you're letting your listener down because you brought in that expert and you teased that expert was going to be there. Now they're not there. It's less of a show, right? So they pulled a no-show, and I would give them no recognition on the show that I was doing at that point and say they didn't show up. I'm not even going to bring it up and just do the show as planned. And yes, I did tease the wrong show, unfortunately, but that's the worst thing that ended up happening because I have a very good show prepared for the Plan B. So unless there's a good reason for the no call, honestly, they shouldn't be welcome back. Especially if there's no call, nothing. They couldn't call, they couldn't email, they couldn't do anything. They thought that little of your show that was going to be like that. Personally, I would not even welcome them back to the show. If you're a nicer person than me, you're going to welcome them back. You let them know once again, this is when you have to be there, blah, 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 and that this is their last chance if you're going to give them a second chance. The next time you do a show on the identical subject, you could actually bring in somebody else that's an expert of it instead of that person. A different expert altogether. To me, I think it's important not to accept that kind of behavior from the guest that you're bringing in because you're looking to spotlight that guest. Believe me, there's something to come onto your show and tout your subject matter that you're bringing on there. And if they think that very little of it, I'd say find somebody else. That's what I would do personally anyway. So what should you have for your Plan B? Well, I don't know what kind of show you're doing, so it's very hard for me without talking to you one-on-one to know what kind of Plan B you should have, but I do know what you shouldn't have on your show. Don't do any show that has been time-stamped, meaning so somebody can figure out when that show was planned.
Right. And they, in the biz, call it evergreen content, right? You can put it out at any time.
Anytime. So you're not going to do a Christmas show in February.
Right.
It's not going to make sense. So, or something that's irrelevant a year from now. This could something we could talk about anytime. Nothing that is a current event because, frankly, it won't be current.
Some shows are tougher because they're about current events.
Right.
That requires some creativity.
Yeah, but you can get into something that's always there.
In politics, you could cover a general topic.
Yeah. How about talking about a famous person in the industry that maybe is deceased? They'll still be deceased.
Yeah.
Right? They are deceased, and you're talking about a legend maybe, right? A legend of the industry. That's a good Plan B type of show. You have the information, the bullet points are there. You can do a whole show on a legend in the industry. How about doing a show highlighting the past of your industry? maybe how the industry started or something like that, or the past of what it is. Again, I don't know exactly what your subject matter is, but if that fits into your subject matter, that's a good Plan B show that's there. Will you ever use it? It's there as an insurance policy. With the No Show podcast, I did a 2-hour podcast once, flipping through the industry's first publication. I had the first publication of it, and I commented on the articles. It was a pretty good episode. It went well. There were no guests. There were no co-host guests. That was one, an emergency podcast that was written down. What if I ever had to do a podcast totally by myself? Well, my 2 co-hosts didn't show up.
Grab the magazine and go.
And there it was. My bullet points was the magazine pages.
Right.
And I did a 2-hour podcast.
And you had them marked out and ready to go when they were needed.
When a day like that happened, and you know what? That day happened, and it's going to happen to you. What about telling your story, the story of the host, your story? Maybe you've never done that before in your podcast and say, well, today I'm going to talk about me and how I got here. Basically interviewing yourself, things you didn't know about the host. You went in the past, go into the future. You can look into your crystal ball of your industry. Do a show about your industry in the future, way into the future. And I did this once, and it actually turned into an annual show.
It's one of the highest rated shows.
Just rambling on where I think the industry is headed and why. It's fun, and sometimes some of the projections I make actually come true. So
sometimes you get angry phone calls.
Right, that's okay. As you start performing a file on Plan Bs, you should see how easy it is, and you'll be tempted to do some of those shows you planned, but please refrain from that unless you have to replace it with another Plan B. That'll being said, that as you do this, you're going to say, that's a good show, and we might as well do this show. No, you're thinking Plan Bs. Put those Plan Bs on there. You will end up using them. They're there. Unless you say, oh, my God, this is too time sensitive, it'll be perfect right now. If you do that, the rule is you have to replace it with another Plan B. Yep. So you got to come up with another Plan B and say, okay, I'm taking this one away. Yep. So that's a rule for yourself to make sure you do.
And how many do you think they should have? Half a dozen anyway?
I would say try to have a dozen of them on there, right? Have more than enough also. Yeah. And if you spend the time to end up putting a dozen of them there, you're going to have more than enough forever, because the deal is you're going to replace all the time you use one, right? And there they are. And if something goes terribly wrong, even if you have a co-host, you hand Plan B over to them if it ended up happening. Easy, ready to go at a moment's notice. That's the key to Plan Bs. You will not waste time. I promise you that. The stuff happens all the time. You'll end up using it. Here at the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, stuff happens all the time. But I would say it happens less than others, because at the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, we help you with that. It's a clean, professional podcast studio with state-of-the-art equipment, professional engineer and producer to make you sound and look good. A little coaching along the way goes a long way, and I hope it does. Are you too busy to do it all yourself? We can help you. We'd love to work with you. Contact me at dave@studio21podcast.cafe. That's Dave at Dave at studio, the number 21 podcast.cafe. Schedule a free 21-minute meeting with me. Let me show you the studio. We'll talk about your thoughts, your plans, or what you want to do for a podcast, and I'll even buy you a cup of coffee. Next week, ideas for segments on your podcast. Segments. It makes the podcast go so much smoother. That's my 21 minutes or less, and we are out of here. You've been listening to the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, live from the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe on the United Podcast Network.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.